I'm now going to give an introduction to our speakers, and first to say that this will be a conversation between Eyene, Billie Zangewa and Marcia Kure on texture, forms and fabrics. So starting with Marcia. Marcia Kure lives and works in New Jersey, USA. Kure trained at the University of Nigeria, where she developed an awareness of modern artistic forms, as well as an eye for the anthropomorphic. Her practice explores themes of female identity, hip-hop culture, and Victorian and historical fashion. Her work has been shown in museums and gallery exhibitions worldwide. Our next artist is Billie Zangewa. Billie Zangewa received her BFA in graphics and printmaking before moving to Johannesburg, where she continues to reside, or where she resides. She worked in the fashion and advertising industries before devoting her time wholly to art. Her work draws upon her understanding of textiles and fashion design and combines art with text and luscious fabrics. And she's also been exhibited in numerous galleries and museums world over. And then moderating this talk will be Eyene. Christine is the Guild Research Fellow in Contemporary Art at the University of Central Lancashire. As an art historian, Eyene is particularly interested in highlighting under-researched narratives and marginalized discourses, notably in the field of modern art. She develops projects around contemporary art from Africa and the diaspora in the UK and internationally. So if you could please all welcome our illustrious panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. And thank you, Billie and Marcia, for accepting this invitation. And thank you, Koyo, for this invitation to moderate this conversation. So we're going to start with you, Billie. You're going to give a short introduction to your work. And I think we have a...
I'd like to just share some images with you and just go into very, quick explanation into some of them. I prepared this whole kind of professional presentation, but actually I want to start with showing you the progression of a piece so you can see the layering of the textile, so you can experience the actual fabric and not just the finished narrative. So this is the progression of Fire Escape, which I'm actually presenting here with Afronova in the art fair. So you can see here as how I choose to develop it and layer it. And then I just like to quickly go through the predominant themes that I've worked with textiles, and they've been the city, personal relationships, and identity. And in the city, my images are a bit distorted. Can I say that? Can I disrupt it by saying that? Actually. But anyway, so this piece is the portrait of a post-apartheid city. And this piece, Troyville Sundays, is looking more at the dubious face of the city that I'm in love with and live in. And then in the personal relationships theme, we have Fantango, which is looking at the beginning of a relationship, that first moment of meeting and the kind of excitement and uncertainty of it. And it's also kind of structured around the idea of the fairy tale ending. So really this is a doomed encounter. And this piece here, Disarming Mars, is more about putting aside those ideas of the happy ending and rather more focusing on physical gratification and just, a superficial interaction. And then here, they look really bad. Is it possible to adjust just to, or is it the well, anyway, so,
by the way, they don't look really bad.
Oh, they don't? Well, let's carry on then. So that piece, Sun Worship in Central Park, is more in the theme of identity. So there, it's kind of like I'm going on a date with myself. So I'm on a date with myself. It's self-discovery. I'm asking myself, how I feel and, what I think about. and it's a beautiful experience. So I'll just, oh, he's still adjusting.
Maybe we can...
You can just carry on. It's fine. Everyone says they're okay.
I think maybe we can...
Yes, so...
Okay, shall we try?
Technology, sorry. He's not getting
okay, I think we,
yes.
Yeah, go on.
And so actually the way that I came to those themes of personal encounters and the kind of exploration of self and identity is that I had a traumatic event and I didn't really know how to deal with it, and I was very confused and a little bit frustrated, and I just felt like, I should get over it. And I just couldn't find a way to move past it. But then, instinctively one day I picked up a piece of textile and I actually transferred that story in text and images onto this piece of fabric. And although as I was doing it, I felt the negative emotions again, when I finished, I actually felt quite lighthearted and happy. So, I found a way to deal with my issues in a way. And so I guess I've been using fabric to ask personal questions about identity, about emotions, about difficult encounters, and also traumas. But not only that, I've also used it to express beautiful abstract emotions and positive things as well. But it really has been, it's been part of my growth as a person. So the silk has been like my companion. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. I'm not sure. Do you want to do your small presentation and then we do the conversation if the images work? Could we have Marcia's slide? Right. Okay, I think I suggest, while the images are sorted, that we begin the conversation, and hopefully at some point we can show the images. The first thing I wanted to say is that, first of all, when I received the email from Koyo to moderate this conversation, I said, yes, it's Billie, it's yes, because we actually met in 1997. I was still a student. I went to Johannesburg for the Johannesburg biennial, and I understand that it's the year you moved to Johannesburg. So we met before, we were really, active on the international art scene. And I remember at the time you had an interest in fashion. So can you explain what led you to practice in the field of visual art as opposed to fashion? But I know you're combining both in a way, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the thing is, I was always interested in being an artist and not working in fashion, but somehow I saw the artistry in fashion, the creativity, the ideas. So it wasn't actually like the fashion trends and the kind of commodification of objects. It was really about the fact that those designers are artists. They've just chosen the garment as their form of expression. So I really appreciated that. But I always wanted to work in the art field, and just at a certain point, I needed to pay my bills, and I got a job in fashion, and I really enjoyed it. And I started moving in that industry, and I did very, very well. And the fashion industry really supported my art career. So it's been a symbiotic relationship.
And Marcia, you trained at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, between 87 and 94, and it's a really young age to decide to become an artist. So I wanted to ask you, was it an outright decision of yours to become an artist, and how did your family react to your choice of studying art?
Well, I would say being an artist has always been that thing that I knew how to do, even at a very young age. Going to the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, was more about this period of time where I had the opportunity to spend a year in any department that I wanted, and so I chose art to do that, the art department to do that. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to meet a lot of wonderful people, so people ranging from Olo Gwibe to Chika Okeke to Obiora Odechukwu. Sylvester Ogbeche was there. The professors, Chika Niako, who introduced us in a very lively way to African art, Ola Oloidi, Ella Natsui. There were all these people there in the university that really expanded the way that I thought about art and things like that. So, I mean, that 1 year became 4 and I graduated. But it was really the kind of education that we also got there, which was really integrated and interdisciplinary. So it was you studying your art and then, having some courses in the sciences, having some courses in theater, anthropology, philosophy. And in the evenings, you go recite poetry, maybe poems that you've written or poems that you just enjoy in this place called the Ant Hill. I was a student movement at that time because it was a period of dictatorship. So it was really a very active period in my life and I enjoyed it, so I stayed on.
Mm-hmm. So your family responded positively with
Not very
your
well.
decision
because my parents wanted me, the big three, medicine, lawyer or engineer, wanted me to become a medical doctor. But I think when I spent that time in the art department and the kinds of ways that they encouraged me to ask questions about life and to look at life and the kinds of people that I met there and their outtake on and their perspective on things really encouraged me to stay there.
And can I ask you the same question? How did your family respond to this desire to become an artist?
Well, at first they were in denial because they could see every evening I was drawing and I was like, oh, I've got to be the best, whatever. And then when I was ready to go to university and I said I want to study fine art, my dad was like, never. And I was going to be the first person in my family to actually get a degree. So I said, well, actually, then I'm not going to university. He was like, okay, it's fine, then you can go. But actually now he's my biggest advocate. When I'm like straying and doing other things, he says, what's going on? Focus. You've always wanted this thing, so do it. So it's great.
So you both have in common to work with or around fabric, textile, cloth as a medium or object of representation. And Billie, you showed a little bit of images. I hope we can have some more images. But can you talk a little bit about your technique and how you source your material? Because we showed, layers, the progression of an artwork. But how do you, what's the process, basically?
Well, I start off really with an idea or an emotion, as I was beginning to say earlier. And then I let the idea kind of develop in my mind until it becomes a visual narrative. And then I do a line drawing and I use that as the template to cut out the silk. And I've sourced my silk really all over the world because, from that point of view, the world is really one. I've sourced fabrics in New York, in Belgium, in London, right here in London, in South Africa. I've gotten some offcuts from Dries van Norton's studio. And I've had friends give me pieces. So, it's been quite organic and very exciting.
And may I ask why silk? Because that's the question.
Well, for me, growing up, I had no access to silk. It was always like cotton. So when I saw silk and it's so rich and, the way it shines, for me, it's like butter, when it reflects in the light. And also historically, it was a sign of status. So, it is something luxurious. So I was quite curious to work with this thing that was foreign to me.
And I want to add as well that your choice of medium was quite unusual in a way in South Africa, because I remember when we met in '97, it was the beginning of the emergence of a new generation of artists who were doing mainly performances, video art, and you chose something that is quite tactile and material based as opposed to immaterial or new media kind of thing. So were you apprehensive, or did you? I mean, you didn't go towards the more fashionable discipline in a way. Did you think about that when when you looked at the art scene in Johannesburg at the time?
Well, I appreciated what everyone was doing, but I was really following my personal journey, and I was interested in texture, and for some reason, I felt a kind of comfort in working with fabric, and I suppose it really comes from personal memory, like being in comfortable sheets or playing in the sheets that are on the washing line or rolling in the curtains. I actually just found it really comforting. So no, I never felt that I should be doing what someone else is doing. I felt like I should see where this was going to take me.
And Marcia, I want to ask you the same question. Your work uses or translates textile material. How did you develop your visual language, and can you also talk about your creative process? And maybe now is the time to have your images if you want.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
So is it possible to have Marcia's slideshow, which is the other one, please?
Yes, and it looks great.
I think it's the one on top. No. Yeah, probably that one. Yeah.
Shall I tune?
Okay. So this one. Okay, all right. The warp, the weave, the weft, Yoji Yamamoto, Isimiyaki, Rei Kawakubo, cloth, Igbo, knock, and uli. Martin Megela, Alexander McQueen, synthesis, simple forms, direct execution, ephemeral script. Cloth becomes body, body becomes cloth. The dressed body, tension and adornment. I think of the cot, the tear of the fabric, drafted pattern, fragments. The line is a cut, a stitch, the tension in collage. Form is the three-dimensional rug. The rug covers shame, blemishes and sores. It's a keeper of secrets. The body is the rug. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, can you maybe give us a few clues on your creative process?
Yeah, basically, most of my work draws from archives. It draws from pulling things from different sources and different places. It uses the language of collage. It uses that way of pulling from different places to create something new. So I would work with archives. I would work with material, putting different things together to create drawings, to create collages. But really thinking about the language of cloth, both in a two-dimensional and three-dimensional form, and also conceptually. So the idea of cloth as the body and the body as cloth always plays that role. The layering of the collage, the layering of cloth, the covering of the rug on the floor, and the relationship between the body and cloth. It's almost always interchangeable. So in terms of pulling materials from my work, I perform, like I said, different sources and use a lot of different kinds of materials or medium. So I moved from collage to drawing to sculpture. For me, it's almost as if it's one language that I'm speaking, even if it's in different forms that it comes out. But sometimes I need to see my form in three-dimensional. I need to see my drawn body in 3 dimensions. I need to see it pulling out from the surface. So in terms of material and where I draw things from and how it affects my work from that stage onto the realization of the piece, all of them constantly are in dialogue.
Thank you. In terms of aesthetics and narrative, Billie, your work is very much naturalistic, and in many ways, and you've explained it a little bit autobiographical. Can you tell us a little bit more about it, and what moments of your life do you choose to put in your work? You know, what guides this? You know, what do you choose to represent? You know, what seminal moments?
Well, basically, I mean, I choose to represent the moments that, for me, feel significant and somehow translate to, you know, they compel me to share them. So the first one obviously was that initial traumatic event. That was really what shifted everything for me. But then also, you know, when I was asking questions about who I am and what I want and whether I'm on the right track, I felt I needed to share that because I felt that it, you know, it's a global experience, that I'm not alone in that. But also when I looked inside of myself and I started to accept myself for who I am, not saying, you know, I shouldn't be like that, I should be like that, but saying, hey, this is who I am and I love myself, and you know, I wanted to share that moment as well. So, and then there's a moment when I said, you know, I feel actually quite at peace, and I wanted to share that moment. So the moments actually really just reveal themselves.
And Marcia, when we look at your work, and I particularly look at the Vogue series, Dressed Up, I think we've got images of Dressed Up here, and fashionable hybrids, we see a number of things, and you've mentioned it in your spoken word presentation, drawing, sculpture, painting, collage, but there's also a multiple hybridity. We've seen, I mean, in your work there are figures that are both anthropomorphic, animal-like, and organic. But there's also a mix. There were some images where there's a mix between figures dressed up, you know, in classical outfit or Victorian outfit.
Dressed Up series,
yeah.
I'm sure.
And there's a mix between that and elements of urban or popular culture, you know, the sneakers and images where there are accessories like the you know, there's a work where there's a pit bull and there's sneakers. And there's also a sort of gender blurring because there you have black male figures with, you know, drapes or dresses that are more identified to Victorian or, let's say, aristocratic white female characters. So can you talk a little bit about that? How do you?
Yeah, I guess
come about with that?
it's I think what. It's really from my transition from the Vogue series to the Dress Up series, that transition and how it took place. For the Vogue series, what I was really looking at was when Uli script that this form of painting and drawing on the female body became transferred onto cloth because they shared certain kinds of similarities, they shared certain kinds of almost like the same language. Just like uli is a covering on the skin, dress is a covering on the body, things like that. So pulling from that, drawing from the concept of uli, it was easy for me to transfer that idea onto clothing. And then I had a good opportunity to work with a Japanese fiber and conceptual artist, Yoshiko Wada, who introduced me to a lot of Japanese designers, but from a conceptual point of view. So people who actually addressed issues of the body, but addressed it from a broader perspective, not just from that commercial place where we all know fashion is known to be, but really looking at it critically and asking questions deeply. So it was easy for me to pull from that idea or that kind of way of thinking and transfer that into my work. In the Vogue series, I was really talking about the duality or the multiplicity of the human of the human being. I have come to a place where I believe that a person is just not one person, but several people in one person. We're like a multitude in a body. And we present ourselves in different ways and in different formats, you know, at different points in time. I am not the same way I am with one friend like I am with the other. So it was just a way of touching upon that, but doing it through the idea of dress. At the time I finished the Vogue series, I was really in a quandary because I had just moved to the United States. And it was a question of really questioning what it was that, where it was that I wanted to take my work to. At that point, you know, I really felt lonely. I felt disconnected. I felt it was as if I was in a limbo. And it was a period of time where I had to start reconstructing, should I say, my influences or my identity, if you will. But the Dressed Up series were actually portraits of me. They were not really, I wasn't looking at them as if they were portraits of people that I was drawing, but it pulled from my post-colonial history and the place where I was presently, which was in the United States of America. The influence of hip-hop came when I got lost during research at the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York. I was going back home and got lost on the subway, and I decided to just hang in there, to just see where the train was going to stop and find my way back home, you know, just retrace my steps, since I wasn't in any rush to get home that evening. And what happened was that I got lost in the Bronx. I found myself in the Bronx in New York. And then when I looked, I mean, the encounter was just so visceral and so profound. It was as if this body had been transferred, you know, from the continent, and it was just right there. I was looking at people who were moving and talking and communicating in a way that I could understand and in a way that I knew. I recognized the bounce and the swagger from high school. I recognized the colors and the slaps on the body, you know, in forms of greetings and, you know, joy. And there was music. It was so profound that at that particular point in time, I was transported back to my parents', you know, sitting room at home, where there were boxes of, you know, influences of rap, of Salt and Pepper, LL Cool J, Womack and Womack, My Fair Lady, all those kinds of influences, James Bond. I mean, there were things that all of a sudden I could make that connection. All of a sudden it all made sense to me. So the other missing part of my collage became the appropriation of hip-hop couture or hip-hop imagery in my in my collage. The Victorian haute couture that I had been studying at the Cooper Hewitt became the second part of these portraits that I pieced together of myself.
Okay. Billie, there's one clearly identified narrative in your work that is self-portrait, and we've seen images. But can you also talk about the representations of social space and metaphor, notably in terms of female narrative, gender relations, and, you know, and love relationships, race, and also architecture?
Wow, that's a lot.
That's a lot, yeah. So maybe we can we skip again to Billie's slideshow? So
well, I tell the story of a female protagonist in the urban setting, and, you know, it is autobiographical because really I draw the information from my own personal experiences, but it's also symbolic of a general state of being. And, you know, for me, architecture is very interesting because I grew up in very small towns that were pristine and nothing was ever run down. You know, there was never like a dangerous corner or anything. So when I moved into the city and I looked at the face of the city, I was completely fascinated. And the thing that fascinated me the most was the kind of the decaying, the transformation, that the thing that happens when you allow it to happen. And so I found a beauty in it. So some people would talk about inner city as a terrible thing and, it's being allowed to decay. But I see a lot of character in it. It's a bit like when you age as a person and you start to get wrinkles and stuff. It's really very, very beautiful and it shows experience. But also I've recently discovered an architect who says, I can't remember her name, but she says that for her, the beautiful thing about a building being erected and finished is that from that moment, the decay begins. So I feel that I resonate with how she feels about buildings. So
it's interesting because in a way it echoes what you were saying about relationships and relationships bound to be doomed.
Yes,
it's sort of
depending on how you approach them.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Art observers usually tend to make visual association when looking at art. And do you, it's a question to both of you, do you acknowledge any, I mean you did in a way, kind of artistic filiation? And are there works of artists that have inspired you or works that you feel your work is in dialogue with? Billie, maybe?
Well, I know that I'm very interested in old posters. So Toulouse-Lautrec for me was quite important. And in a way, when I did Le Fantango, the woman in the dance, I was actually kind of channeling Toulouse-Lautrec and some of the kind of political posters also from Russia and so on. But then when I was on a residency in the Bronx in New York, I discovered Kerry James Marshall and also how he deals with like black identity. And I don't know why, but I actually resonated with that. And at a certain moment when I was producing some work, I was also, channeling him. I was thinking about like the emotional state. And also, I'm also very interested in Japanese designers. So I think about how for them it's not just making clothes, it's creating form, it's like sculptures. So also, I think about that. So I'm definitely, thinking about different things. I'm not necessarily thinking about it on a visual level, more on the emotional.
And before you were also talking about Sophie Calle. Is it Sophie Calle?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I find it interesting that because, I feel that some of the things that I have put into a narrative have been incredibly personal and people have said to me, wow, you're so brave. But for me, it doesn't feel brave. It feels like something that should be shared because often when we have a relationship that fails, we feel so much shame. We don't actually want to talk about it. But I'm saying, you know what? Let's talk about it. Let's make our shame public. And it's like it's a human thing. And, by her publishing her breakup letters, whatever, I feel like she's also saying the same thing. She's saying, sometimes these things don't work. You feel this way. This happens. It's awkward. You're angry. And I think it's a good thing for us to do as a society is to actually, share and be compassionate towards each other.
Yeah. And I just want maybe to use the fact that we have that to look at this image, which is interestingly, I remember when we did the show in Paris, Iman Fares. I mean, we didn't have this piece, but I wrote something for the publication, and you were. I actually titled my exhibition En toute innocence because of the way your work is so subtle and so feminine, but at the same time empowering. And can you talk a bit about this one, about the rebirth of that?
Well, this is when I was doing that whole thing of looking inside and saying, okay, so maybe I'm not so great there, but I love myself anyway, and I'm going to acknowledge that part of myself. And so that sash says, surrender wholeheartedly to your complexity. So really, it's like embrace yourself, love yourself. I mean, some people might say, hey, like, I'm not digging that part of you. And, I want to say, well, that's too bad, because, that part of me is who I am. And, I think I'm pretty cool. So, and, we should, like I was saying about compassion, a person cannot be perfect. No one is perfect. And that's the problem with the fairy tale ending in relationships, is that we're expecting perfection, and it doesn't exist. We are flawed and we're perfect at the same time. So, and you know, for me it's also a state of self-empowerment, because by acknowledging who I am and embracing it completely, I am a more powerful person. I can go through the world with more self-assurance. So that's why I titled it The Rebirth, and making reference to Venus, a goddess. So it's, you know, it's a self-empowerment piece.
And Marcia, are there artists? I mean, you touched on it earlier, but like, do you feel that? Is there a dialogue that your work has with other artists that with whom you feel connected in a way?
Yeah, I do that, but I think in an overall way, I look for ideas or inspiration rather from non-artistic fields, if you will, if there's anything like that. I don't think there's a field that's not artistic, but so for thinking about connection, or thinking about how we're all interconnected, for example, or trying to touch on that in my work. For me, I pull a lot from Stephen Hawking when he would ask the question, why are we here? I mean, when you look at it from that perspective, there's so many things, perception and all that just dissolve, you know, and you're looking at it from a much broader perspective, and I like that kind of engagement. And so, I'm constantly looking at, you know, different disciplines or different ways to get inspiration. Of course, it's almost standard. You know, you go somewhere, you see something you like, you pull from that, or, you know, right from school, and, you know, like I talked about in fashion and stuff like that. Those are the, like, I think, given. I just feel like on a broader, more larger scope, you know, where I base my work from, you know, is from that very high plane.
And your work seems to reveal a sort of serial approach, if I may say. How do you develop a series, and what nurtures it, and how do you feel, or when do you feel that you've achieved either your aesthetic exploration or thematic exploration in your work?
When I was in school, Obiorode gave me an assignment. He asked me to do one thing, and I did several. And since then, he encouraged me that if one wasn't enough, I could, because it was almost like I could say it in so many other ways. And in saying it in so many other ways, they kind of became connected. They were one body, but they were all, you know. Same thing too with pulling from this idea from Stephen Hawking, but it's a way of going into a problem, or a way of trying to solve something in my studio, and I find out that there's so many ways that I want to say the same thing. And when I've done one and it's enough, I just move on to the next one. And in most of the cases, I've found a lot of people like to show my work in series, because when you show one, it looks very lonely. Mm-hmm. But that's the way I normally create the series, and it never really ends for me per se. It flows, continues to inform my work in one way or the other, and naturally, I guess it would dissolve. But when that dissolution takes place, I'm not quite sure. Mm.
And Billie, you're not working in the same way.
Well, I have a short concentration span, so I actually find it quite difficult to focus. But ironically, if I may, the body of work that I've been working on at the moment is actually the first time that I feel that I can make a series. So these 3 pieces are part of the series that I'm working on at the moment. So actually, now I am working on a series. I can focus.
So well, how did the series start, and what are you looking, or what are you exploring in the series?
Well, I'm exploring pretty much the same thing I've been exploring, which is really life in the urban environment as an African woman today and in an African city, and the kind of concerns and preoccupations. So when we go back to this piece, this is, really more about like the supermarket age and our food supply and how dubious it is, and how do you take charge of that in that urban environment. And then this piece is also about like time. How do you put yourself first, because you're so caught up in obligations in the city, which is just there, like it's never going away, it's just there. But it's really nice to just get away and come back to oneself. So I mean, they're very everyday issues. And this piece is more about appreciating the urban environment, but also knowing when you can leave. So, yeah.
That's a question to both of you. What are the impulses in your practice? Do you work when there's a creative, well, not do you work, but like, is there a creative urge that's sort of driving the way, you create? Or do you work on commissions or for exhibition, for projects? How do you go about that? And I'm asking that also because I know that your work is very intricate and it takes a long time, to create. So how do you go about that?
Well, I find that having a goal helps me to focus, but I start by tidying up, really. I tidy up the whole house, fold things, and then, when everything else is clear, then I can sit down and do it. But I don't really work on commissions in that I'm going to give you Billy. I'm not going to give you. It's like you do it, So that's not really something that drives me. It's more what do I want to do? What do I want to say? And, that's what I do. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, working on commissions, I like working on commissions because it gives me a challenge, which is it gives me like a set of rules and some set of limitations which I like to work with. But also I love the freedom of having to create my work from scratch. Like the show at 154 was created, just for 154.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about that.
Yeah, so it was very exciting for me to do that, even talking about the space and, sending photographs back and forth and figuring out where each piece is supposed to be, and finishing an installation right there on the site. It's enjoyable on both platforms, I would say. Each one has its own ways of engaging with it, and each one presents with it its own challenges, I guess. But I've worked with, most of the time, I had a problem with one of my galleries in New York who tried to, but I couldn't. I had to be honest to my work. Most of the time, in terms of dealing with someone who is really interested in taking your, in helping you build your career, it's very important. It was very important for me to find someone who would allow me be who I am. And in most cases, in my shows, nobody knows what I'm showing until
you install.
Yeah.
And actually, I want to go back to you, Billie, because I saw the show that you curated, Hollandaise, and actually my question was also, how do you, the show was very much about the wax, the textile, and I know that you're usually creating from your own, perspective or narrative. So how do you engage with a curatorial narrative? How do you appropriate it in your work? In that case, how did you?
Well, the exciting thing about that was that it was actually concerning trade routes. Mm-hmm. So the silk trade route. I mean, it's absolutely incredible because it's also come to Africa. It's accessible. I can go to the shop down the road and it's there, and I can appropriate it and make it mine. So from that point of view, I felt that there was a parallel thing going on. Mm-hmm. But also, what was exciting was that I could create a kind of a trompe-l'oeil. So I was imitating the Hollandaise textile, but using silk. Mm-hmm. So there was a conversation happening between two different types of textile. Mm-hmm. So, I enjoyed that. It was a beautiful challenge. It was stimulating.
Mm-hmm. And you named the pieces they had like...
Yes, well, there were the different textiles. Mm-hmm. So I really liked that because they were like powerful African women. So, you know, that also really resonated with what I was saying in my work.
Yeah, and talking about the piece that you created here for 154, there's an interesting fact that you both have an artwork that has the same name. Guess who's coming to dinner? So I think maybe we can have a conversation about your different takes on the, you know, on the piece. So we don't have the image, but maybe you can describe it's. Well, yeah, maybe because yours is back from dates from. Can't remember the date of your piece.
It's a while back,
an old
a
one,
few years, yeah. Well, and my piece is a long piece, and it's people sitting at a table, and it's the family of my ex.
Can you? Everyone knows who's coming. The film.
Yes.
Guess who's coming to dinner.
So basically, it's the other family, and he's sitting next to me, and I'm kind of going out of the picture frame, so I'm kind of cut out, and I look very awkward. I look so fragile. And, you know, it's because I kind of experienced that, something that I actually hadn't, because I guess I'd been, you know, living in this perfect world, and that I was living in a colorblind world. So when I encountered this kind of awareness of color and this biracial relationship, you know, it was a very difficult situation for me. And I guess I wanted to describe that situation by using a reference that was well known. So that's why I used the title, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, to help to tell my narrative.
And your piece, you can talk about your piece.
Well, for this show, for Guess Who Is Coming to Dinner, I think I really wanted to get to the mind or to the crux of something. And normally what I do is I create narratives, because then it makes them very personal, and then I can ask very hard questions and take time to figure out what it is, or what I imagine these kinds of encounters, what kind of discussions or conversations will you know, emerge from these encounters. So for Guess Who Is Coming to Dinner for 154, what I did was take on the film, but then continue the narrative from that space. So it continues that John Prentice marries Joey, and they move to the Democratic Republic of Congo. His mother moves to London, where she opens a gallery and is introducing American artists to the audience. And the guest who she is inviting to dinner is Sam Wagstaff, who is was a well-known American curator who kind of like brought this whole new way of looking at photography, and created, you know, photography as helped create the place where photography occupies today as a work of art in its own right. So it was really looking at Sam Wagstaff, his life, and looking at that collection, and thinking about his own personal struggles, because he was gay, and it was a very difficult time to talk about this in New York in the 80s. But he had this dual personality where he would go to all these very dark, shady clubs in the night, and then in the morning, of course, he's this big curator who is doing all this amazing work. But somehow I found that, you know, it was pulling from that dark place that informed his collection of photography, which I found very interesting. And of interest to me was the fact that he collected a lot of ethnographic material, he collected a lot of medical material. It was a way of looking at photography in a new way, you know, making the argument that it was both art and document. He had this dual, just like him, you know, it was just two things in one. So it was almost as if he was photography and photography was him. But in the terms of trying to escape into this space, he would look at like landscapes and, you know, be in a different place. So for him, photography was really therapeutic. And looking at his collection, you could see all the kinds of struggles that he went through in his life. So hence, there's a lot of photography elements in the show here at 154. Now, Joey's mother is struggling with the fact that her son-in-law and daughter have moved to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and they have a son, and where almost as if the perception of race now changes. It's shifted, and she's struggling with this, and they have these very difficult conversations that have to take place. The artworks themselves are supposed to be this kind of hard discussions that take place, but drawing from the archive, drawing from different sources, like I said, from material. And some of the imagery that I pulled from was from the Smithsonian Institution, from Sam Wagstaff's seminal collection, and reinterpreting them, or this narrative where you have that forced union of the collage and the tension that it creates, and trying to talk about that dual personality in him with the androgynous series, but that the concept of one moves into a line in the other, and then it becomes three-dimensional form in the sculpture. So I'm really talking about the body in different ways. Yeah.
And because we're in the context of an art fair, I want to ask to both of you, what is the nature, it's a bit of a tricky question, what's the nature of your dialogue with gallerists or collectors when you create new piece, whether you're commissioned or if you have existing pieces that you're creating? Do you feel pushed to remain within a, if I may say, sellable kind of aesthetic, or do you feel that, how do you negotiate, the fact that obviously your work has to get, to be collected, but also how do you negotiate that and your, room for experimenting? I know it can be a tricky question to answer.
Go ahead.
Well, for me personally, when I make a piece of a work, I have to forget about what's happening on the outside. So, I can't actually be thinking, is the gallery going to want this? Is the collector going to like it? Then, I might as well give up and go and sit in the garden and read a book and have a cocktail, because, it defeats the whole point of what I do. I do what I do because for me it's about freedom of expression. And right now I choose to do this, and that's why I do it.
Yeah, I think I would just say that I've chosen to make art, and nobody's going to take that right away from me.
And I remember we had a conversation years ago about the fact that you were in a situation where your work was collected, but so it would go from from you to the collector, and you wanted to have your work exhibited and engage with the audience. How important is that for you to to have this sort of dialogue with the audience?
I think sharing is caring. So, it's nice to have the work out there for people to also appreciate. So, it would be nice if the collector wants to share.
And again, still in the context of the fair, how is the market treating you? Do you sell well? Is it? I remember when when Afronova started, and I was in conversation with Henri, and he was Henri Vergon, who will be talking tomorrow. Henri?
No, tomorrow? I think the day after.
On Sunday.
Was it? Yeah.
He was saying that he opened the exhibition. It was a sellout. So has it been, has the market been good for you in Africa or beyond the continent? Or who is buying your work? Is it like in, Nigeria or South Africa or outside the continent? I'm sure it is outside the continent.
Yeah, for me it's both. So I'm very lucky to have support in South Africa. But actually that moment that Henri speaks about was actually very strange for me, because I was completely disconnected from it. Because when I was doing what I was doing, it wasn't really about that. And although, it's a nice thing, but even today I can say that I never actually experienced that. I didn't, I was there and it was my show and it was great, but I wasn't there, I really wasn't. And so when you talk about it, I feel like you're talking about someone else. So...
And you, Marcia?
Yeah, we've done quite well. I'm very happy about that. And the thing is also that there are a lot of collectors who are willing to make the trip outside, from the continent to be in this fair. So I think the fair offers that kind of platform. And so I've met a lot of my friends, I've met a lot of people who I've known in Nigeria for quite some time, and the stand here, and yeah, so it's been a good thing, from all over, I guess. So yes, it's been good.
So before we open to the floor, I want to ask you, what are your next projects? Projects coming up?
I've still got a lot to say in this series. I'm not done yet. It's only 3.
Projects. I'll be working with Koyo with Body Talk in Brussels. I'm very excited about. This will be in February. And then I have a solo show in New York, which will be like a new body of work. In February as well, and then I come back to London for a show, hopefully in conjunction with Alexander McQueen at the V&A.
Wow, yes. Okay, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes. So thank you so much. We're going to open to the floor. Are there any questions in the room?
If you can wait for the mic to come to you and just say your name. Sorry, I'm speaking without the mic myself.
There's one question here.
My name is Lisa Zangewa. Billie, I just have a question for you. I'm interested in your use of language and titles, and you said a lot of them seems to be quite autobiographical. But I was just wondering about the overlay of language, French and English, as in the tango work, and why French? Which languages are you using? I mean, what is the role of script generally in your works?
Well, that's kind of making reference to Last Tango in Paris. It was set in Paris, and it's kind of like a broken French, because in French fantango doesn't really exist, but it's also like the dance, like the so there's just a little play with words. But the titles for me at that stage, I did go through a stage where I used images and text, so it just helps me to carry my narrative forward. And as I said, the old poster also is something that I find very interesting, the aesthetic of it.
Oh, there's a question here. It's coming.
Oh, thanks. I'm Chris Spring. Billie, I'm very interested in what's missing from your works, as well as what's there. And I noticed that fire escape never reaches the ground. I mean, and the lady who's sitting in the piece of waste ground with the city behind her, that's complete. And it seems like a kind of idyllic moment, Am I barking up the wrong tree, or are those important kind of elements and the dance is like a fragment, Are those?
Well, actually, the process is actually quite organic and instinctive. So I remember when I did the one piece, Exquisite Fantasy, I really wanted to have a little piece cut off, but I just forgot. And then some pieces just feel like they don't need it, but it's not really about whether it's complete or not. Yeah. It's maybe that you've got a piece in your pocket, and I'm hoping that you'll just put it there and finish it.
And I love the idea of the silk, just the material. Mm-hmm. And you talk about it being luxurious. It's a very powerful fabric, but very fragile at the same time, I think, and that comes across pretty strongly in your work. And also where it's coming from, It has a kind of evocation of the Indian Ocean and that very, very ancient kind of trade.
Yeah, but actually a very interesting thing that's come to light for me is that I started out doing portraits of the city, and then I found a way to work through my issues and find a catharsis. And then, I was transforming something into something else. I was like, transformation. I'm actually dealing with transformation. And of course, silk is a byproduct of transformation. So, and I'm thinking maybe that's actually the subconscious reason why I was using it to deal with the idea of converting something negative into something positive, something abstract into something tangible. So in a way, there's a kind of a circle that's happened.
Thanks, lovely work.
Thank you.
Any other question?
Hi, it's Kenneth Montague. I'm a collector from Toronto. And Marcia, I'm just wondering, a little bit about the, just in terms of your educational background, this experience in Nsukka, and thinking about that Nsukka school. I was in Nigeria last year, and just I'm kind of putting the threads together and figuring out in what way maybe that particular experience influenced you, and do you see or do we feel it still in your work, or is that something that was sort of along the way and now is something that in some way you don't reference, or has that school experience been paramount for your practice?
It's been quite parallel to my practice. I think when I came to the United States, what happened was I had the chance to look at uli very, very closely and intensely because it was my connection. And I really wanted to find out the essence of what uli really was. I wanted to break it down to its separate components and then pull out from it at any point in time what was useful to me. Uli is a script, it's a language, it's, when you think about it that way, you think about the body in motion, or you think about gestures, there are just ways in which language can transfer to that. Uli is a script that deals with positive and negative space. Uli is a script that deals with the curvilineal structure of things, or the organic structure of things. It's very lyrical. If you look at my drawings very closely, uli is always present. I like the way that it dissolves and becomes into something else. I like the way that it has expanded and become something else, because uli has that power to speak to. It doesn't really have to constantly be that thing that you recognize in my work. So I was encouraged in school to think about uli as in terms of expressing a movement, or with a gesture, with a hand, or with a drawing, and thinking about that in terms of Chinese calligraphy, where you use the breath, direct execution. There is no erasure. Watercolor does that. It's there and it's done. Whatever mistakes you make, you accept it. So probably that's why I'm drawn to watercolor. Probably that's why I'm drawn to creating my own pigments myself, just like the women in southeastern Nigeria would make their pigments. So I still make my pigments in my kitchen today and take to the studio and use to create that. So that is like a link that I would never let go of. But in terms of pushing it from where Uche Okeke took it to, and pushing it beyond that has been like a quest in my work. And now the question is really that, okay, so if uli is on the skin, how else can I make reference to uli in terms of transferring that same idea of uli onto clothing? So clothing, in a way, is uli.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm Koyo. I have a simple question. When I was preparing these conversations, I sort of felt like I don't know how much you know of each other, or how much you know of each other's work. I work quite intuitively sometimes. So my question is, do you see any sort of correspondence and a dialogue?
Yes,
maybe
yes,
even if you are not working together, close friends or whatever, and coming from the same backgrounds, because I feel it very intensely in both of your works, even though you use slightly different formalistic languages. So I would be very interested for you to talk about this correspondence, maybe.
Well, I'm having a shiver right now. Thank you, my lost sister.
Because I mean, even when you look at Billie's work and you think about painting, you look at her work and you think about texture. And even her way of approaching ideas, when she said that this came from a very difficult place, my interaction with cloth too came from a very difficult place. It was after the introduction of Sharia law in Kaduna State, and during this terrible riot, a relative of mine was killed and his body was desecrated. So it wasn't just a question of that he was dead, but it's just the manner of which his body was all over the place. So when stories of survival started coming in, what stood out for me the most was, the stories that stood out for me the most were stories that had to do with these encounters where you were wearing the wrong thing at the wrong place and you were caught on the other side of the border. So if you were Christian, you were in the Muslim side, you were wearing something that identified you as you're gone, vice versa. I mean, it was both sides were, you know, doing all kinds of terrible things to each other. But I mean, to think that what you were wearing could decide whether you could live or die. I mean, to me, the whole idea of what cloth was completely changed. I think if something can decide whether you are going to live or die, it's something that needs or deserves a second look. So the same thing too, you know, it came from a very difficult place, from a very difficult experience, this interaction with cloth, and the way that I started looking at cloth and dealing with it and trying to see all those kinds of relationships between the role that cloth plays, even in popular culture. And then in LA, you have the Blood and the Crips, you know, you have your blue and your red, you wear the place where you're not supposed to wear it, you're gone. I mean, we think about Trayvon Martin, I mean, and he was wearing a hooded shirt and he was thought to be a suspicious character. This was clothing on his body. So, I mean, when you think about clothing in those kinds of terms, clothing takes on a different kind of narrative or story, if you will.
Yeah, so, I mean, I agree. You know, I think that when people think about clothing and fashion, they immediately think about like trends and the kind of the hungering for the latest thing. But, you know, there is a different side to clothing. And it's something that's quite global. It's something that we all have in common, that we can't escape as people, is that it's part of our identity and we are communicating with it on so many different levels all the time. It's just that sometimes it can be an individual interpretation. But for me, what I found, you know, the most exciting and refreshing is the fact that we both love the same Japanese designers.
Oh, very good.
Are there any other questions in the room? No? I think we can do any other final words that you want to...
Thank you so much for coming.
Yes, thank you very much.